Hello, and thanks for joining us for Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar. When we talk about environmentalism, this topic can often be associated with doom and gloom, or some argue even an alarmist or divisive point of view. Well, Peter Kareiva has spent years trying to change that. Exactly who is Peter Kareiva? He's a scientist at UCLA and one of the most renowned climate scientists in the US. And now he is the new president and CEO for the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach. Ironically, Kareiva has angered many of his fellow environmentalists with his tell-it-like-it-is style. He's even reprimanded the enviro community for demonizing science deniers and corporations. Kareiva has a unique approach to bring everyone together to combat climate change and global warming. And those efforts begin with inclusion, not exclusion. What exactly is sustainability?
The way I think about sustainability is that no one, not one of us, wants to use the planet or use resources so that tomorrow we're worse off, next week we're worse off, next year, next century we're worse off. So it's this notion that let's not use up our future opportunity. And then economically, it's come increasingly to involve senses of fairness and equity, so that it's not a sustainable world if, you've made sure that there'll always be enough food. Yeah, you make sure that you'll have clean, fresh water, but 1% of the population has access to most of it, and the rest of the population is just barely getting by on those resources. So it's this very scientific idea that deals with ecology and the natural sciences and the physical sciences. It's this quality of life idea. And then there's an economic notion in terms of distribution of resources. Sustainability is how we live upon the planet. Certainly, how we act as consumers, certainly what businesses do, government policy, but it's just the way we live on the planet.
We often hear the term staunch environmentalists or environmentalists. Where was this born out of? When did this really all begin? The advocacy and the activism, if you will.
The misbehavior of companies with technology, the activism of the Vietnam War, and then people taking environmental issues to the court. So litigation, suing about endangered species. So it's all those coming together.
It's so polarized when you talk about the environment or sustainability. It's either liberal versus conservative, left versus right, environmentalists versus business interests. How can we bring folks together and collaborate?
What you said is exactly right, and at the same time it's also totally wrong. And I say that because of my old job at the Nature Conservancy. I used to, be asked to go to Texas and Utah and talk to climate deniers or just people like that. And in my conversations, everybody's an environmentalist. Do you think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to go spoil the world, I want to pollute the world, I want to destroy it? So we kind of created a story that has, generated exactly what you described, that it's Republican versus Democrat. We didn't need to. We didn't need to at all. And it's partly the fault of the environmental movement for being so quick to judge people as anti-environmentalists. Instead, maybe what you could do is start on finding common ground.
The issue is finding common ground, because as much as we all care about the environment, we want a future for everyone, don't business interests, don't conservatives, doesn't corporate America have a right to say, maybe this isn't such a good thing, or we need coal, or we need the Keystone Pipeline, or we need desalination, turning ocean water into drinking water? Don't those folks have a right to their opinion as much as environmentalists do about sustaining the environment?
Well, first of all, any environmental decision is both science and a public policy and a political process. So certainly they have the right to their opinion. But I think we're kind of founded, and most countries are founded on the notion that there's a limits to rights. So there's a limit that if they pollute the environment in a way that hurts the health of people downstream in the river, they don't have that right. So, it's a well-established principle that the rights of business are not unlimited. They are bounded, and most businesses would agree that. Today, 19 out of 20 the leading business schools in the US have corporate sustainability programs. Almost every company has sustainability reports. Sometimes they may be greenwashing, but just the fact they invest in making them gives you some sense of a change in values. I mean, corporations, in the climate policy, many of the private sectors ahead of the US federal government right now.
Yeah, but let me jump in here for a second, because as an example, one industry is the oil industry. Those folks believe fracking and intense oil drilling is good for the nation. Environmentalists believe it's bad, harms the environment, does terribly catastrophic things potentially to us. How do you bring those two sides together?
The way I would start that conversation is I would admit to the values of those corporate leaders, and instead of immediately saying you don't care about the environment, I'd say you care about the environment. I know you care about the environment. I find out about some things they did about the environment. A lot of those companies invest a lot in cleaning up the water, the produced water from fracking. So they care about that technology. And then you would make the argument that, I understand your values, but I also understand the pressures you have to make money. And I'd sort of start the conversation in a less accusatory way. Do you agree in 100 years we have to be all fossil fuels? Bet you if you ask that question, most of them would say yes. So then you start with that. Then you work backwards. You say, well, let's look at the science. Guess what? It's happening faster than anybody thought. These are actually the conversations I used to have with CEOs of companies. For sure, there are individuals who are bad actors as leaders of corporations. You can find that in any profession. If you try to find that common ground, both the common ground that we really do have to get off fossil fuels within 100 years, the common ground that you do care about the environment. I've had CEOs tell me I don't want my daughter to think I'm a bad guy.
Where do you find fault with environmentalists and their cause and advocacy, or do you?
There's a sort of a portfolio of diversity of environmentalists. You have, Greenpeace, who does these really clever things, that seriously are meant to embarrass. You have less theater, more social policy advocates who still might overstate things a little bit. The extremely ardent environmentalists might say the planet or species has rights. Okay? So think of it. So the planet and species has rights, human rights, and animal rights. Now I think every one of us agrees that that's true. That there's all three of those rights are valid, legitimate, ethical rights. We just weigh them differently.
You seem to have a very centrist, independent position where you see both sides. You see the great work environmentalists are doing, but you also appreciate the great work business interests are doing and how the two can morph together.
Part of that is I have a real appreciation of jobs.
Is there a way to have a clean, safe, healthy environment and also have a great amount of jobs?
Absolutely.
What do you see as some of the major environmental and sustainability issues of our day?
Any person who's an environmental scientist has to say that it's climate change. I mean, climate change is an existential threat. Globally, if you disrupt climate systems enough that major weather patterns, major air streams and ocean circulation, if you disrupt them that much, it's going to change the experience of nations in a way that the nations are going to be disrupted. We're not there yet, and I don't want to sound like a doom and gloom, but you have to accept that there is a finite probability that could happen, and that should give you pause.
Joining me now to discuss this further is Megan Sally Wells. Megan is the former mayor of Culver City and is now currently a council member there. She has been in public service for the last decade and has spent most of her career advocating for environmental causes and affecting change in the process. Thanks so much for being here, Megan.
It's my pleasure.
Hey, we have a lot to talk about with your city, Culver City. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. First, though, let's discuss my interview with Peter Kareiva. Doesn't he seem to take the approach of reason over radicalism when speaking about the environment, climate change, global warming, all that stuff? What's your take on my interview with him and what he has to say and his approach?
Well, I mean, to me, he talked a lot of sense. I am a Bruin, second generation, so I have a soft space in my heart for UCLA, of course, and their excellent work. And reason versus radicalism. It's easy to try to go to extremes, and I think he's going down the middle, which is a sensible and somewhat comfortable place to be. So. I think it was an interesting, he brings a lot to the table. And I guess personally that frame is a little troubling to me because, the way I define radicalism is, I think it's radical to pollute the planet, right? I think it's radical to have your business based on something that harms people. And so I think, sometimes we bandy about some of these extremes, but at the end of the day, I hope that we're all really focused on making sure that we have a livable planet with livable wages.
And you are a staunch environmentalist. I hope that's not a bad word now after talking to Peter Kareiva.
Not to me.
Did you take issue with anything else that Peter told me, particularly the way he wants to sort of speak with businesses and not demonize them, or the science deniers, or whatever the case may be?
Well, I mean, talking is good. The dialogue is good. And I don't think any of us can afford to not be involved in environmental work in some way. So whatever allies in that fight, I think, are worthy allies. And I think really for too long, there's been this just false dichotomy. A false dichotomy, it's like either jobs or it's environmental. And, what California has really proven is that the environment and good union jobs go hand in hand. There are more solar jobs in California than there are coal jobs in the entire United States. I mean, by a large factor. And so, the thought that somehow environmentalism is pitted against business or good jobs, I think it's false. I think it's misleading. And I think California in particular has proven that that's old news. And we have a lot of building to do. And I happen to believe very firmly in the Green New Deal, that this is an historic moment where we need to build out infrastructure. We need to create good jobs, just like the New Deal back in the day, right, with the Great Depression. This is the time where we need to step up as a society to make sure that people have decent wages, good jobs, and also we have a planet on which to enjoy them. And all of those things are completely complementary. They do not contradict one another whatsoever.
One would hope that's the case. However, you can't discount that narrative because there is sort of a tale of two worlds, and Peter is saying, look, environmentalists should not demonize people who disagree with him, although consequently he, and I'm sure as you would agree, certain businesses or industries should be reprimanded. Correct, Megan?
It's never good to poison your neighbor.
Yeah.
Right? Like if your neighbor is actually poisoning you, they need to be called out. And sometimes it takes strong language, what you might call demonizing, to bring attention and to stop that, because, we deserve to live safely, to breathe clean air, and to have a future. And so I understand when the environmental movement is strong and stated, and but I don't find that radical. I find the opposite radical.
It's possibly not radical. However, why then, and I ask you as both an environmentalist and a politician, are we so polarized here in the U.S. over things like, let's just say, for example, climate change and global warming, and what do we do about all this? Because look, you cannot deny this, Megan, there are such warring political factions here in the U.S. Everything seems to get politicized, and in my opinion, it is both the Democrats and the Republicans to blame.
Well, I'd have to say that, you know, this is not a great time for nuance, right? Everything is heightened, right now, especially. And what we're seeing more and more are just real, you know, systemic, fundamental inequities that are pulling people apart. And what we really need is to come together. Now, that doesn't mean that I compromise and say, oh, polluters, go pollute. I don't care. It doesn't matter. It just creates jobs. No way. That's not smart. That's not realistic. And it's you know, definitely not the right way forward. So accountability is absolutely important. But again, you know, this either or is, you know, I think it's kind of made up. It's divide and conquer, right? Divide and conquer, everybody loses. And I think what we need today more than ever to survive on this planet, to thrive economically, to be a fairer, more just society, is to unite in order to thrive together. And, you know, it's easy to get caught, like I'm on Twitter, right? It's easy to get caught up in absolutisms. But really, I mean, where people live is I would say that it's a middle ground without compromise. In other words, you don't have to be all one thing or all another. We just want to live our lives and respect one another. And I think it's going to take some solid dialogue and some healing, really, as a society to get back to that place. And I think when there's less inequality, more of us can focus on building that future together.
So final question then, you presented the issues, thank you for that. How can we find a solution? In other words, how can environmentalists and business interests work together for the greater good? Final question.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just take Culver City, for example. We're a city of 5 square miles in the west side of Los Angeles. We, as of last year, have been running on 100% renewable energy. Not in 10 years, not in 20 years, today. And for the past year, all of our businesses, all of our residents, and all municipal facilities, 100% renewable. That's creating good union jobs. That's helping our local economy, not some far out place, you know, that it's actually through something called the Clean Power Alliance that has public benefits, job training, et cetera, et cetera. So like the future, and even I would say the present, at least here in Culver City, is one where we are not enemies. We're just building smarter, right? It's we know better, right? We have the technology. Energy that we depend on shouldn't kill us, and it doesn't have to. And in fact, is a tremendous opportunity to build wealth in our communities without compromising on our lung health or our future on this planet. So I'm actually really excited because I can see it working right now.
Thank you, Megan Sally Wells, with great conviction, the City Council member of Culver City. Really, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And talking about environmentalists and business interests and working together, there is no bigger business than war. War, certainly because of all the military contracts, is a massive money generator and also a massive environmental polluter. Public media partner EarthFix travels to the Pacific Northwest to explain how years of Portland, Oregon prosperity from World War II shipbuilding morphed into a polluted wasteland that still has environmental consequences today. Producer Cassandra Profita has our story.
Today, Portland's South Waterfront has all the amenities of a modern city neighborhood.
Aha, here we go. It's right here.
But if you look closely, you can still see traces of a dirty industrial past.
This has been here since the late 40s or 50s or 60s. I don't know when this was tossed over here.
This chunk of metal came from the hull of a warship, one of many left to rust on the banks of the Willamette River.
I notice here there's a big shackle.
Paul Fishman spent years digging through the toxic mess.
In the late 40s, through the 1950s, into the 1960s, we didn't have environmental laws. They did not know that, oh, this is full of PCB and that could cause cancer. They didn't know that. Right here, this is a fire brick from a ship's boiler. This was here, we kind of left it. Why pull it all out and put different rocks in there? Let's just leave this. I mean, in an engineering sense, it works. It also says to people, there was something else here, historically. Wonder what that was.
We'll build and sail them, we'll never fail them. The victory fleet will be complete, we know.
During World War II, shipyards were the pride of Portland.
The victory fleet will soon defeat the foe.
At their peak, they were launching a new ship every 4 days. Some would boast they were building ships faster than Hitler could sink them. President Roosevelt told Americans these ships would bring liberty to Europe. He called for a 7-day work week to build these Liberty ships even faster to win the war.
While we are proud of what we are doing, this is certainly no time to be content. We must build more cargo ships and still more cargo ships.
As soon as one ship was launched, the keel was immediately laid for the next ship on that building way. Speed was encouraged and many times quality suffered. But these ships were designed to be essentially expendable. If the United States got 2 trips of cargo across to support the troops, it was a job well done.
After the war was over, the Victory ships were obsolete, but they still had value as scrap metal. Emery Zidell turned one of Portland's wartime shipbuilding sites into the nation's largest ship-breaking operation. But the ship-breaking wouldn't go nearly as fast as the shipbuilding. For decades, the Zidell dock on Portland's South Waterfront was full of warships waiting to be cut up and sold for scrap.
Mounds and mounds and mounds of metal. Just one heap after the next. It was very rusty and gritty, and you'd kind of go, who would want to go out there?
From 1946 through the 1970s, the business dismantled around 300 ships.
I remember Dad would come home and he would say that we could go down and go on a particular ship before they started to dismantle it. They had that kind of rusty smell. You know, there's certain smells you sort of can't forget.
Bill Goebel started working in the scrapyard in 1960, when he was just 16 years old.
So these pieces, they've come off of the ships when we were in the dismantling days. Stern pieces, and that's a bow piece there.
Some ship hulls were filled with concrete for ballast. Those pieces, and anything else that didn't have scrap value, were left on the banks of the river.
The very end of it, you know, you'd have everything cut down to the last 5 or 6 feet of the ship, and then that's what these would be.
The company stopped dismantling ships in the late 70s, but the process of cutting up ships left a lot more than metal and concrete behind. When Jay Zidell took over the business from his father, he inherited a polluted wasteland.
The world's changed a lot since my dad was young and active and growing the business. We now know that there were materials on the ship that represented environmental issues, lead-based paint, the asbestos, PCBs, and other things that we ran across. But at the time we were doing it, nobody knew that they were hazardous.
The pollution covered 30 acres of land and half a mile of riverbank. Reviving the site would be a massive undertaking.
This is certainly the biggest project I've ever done.
The Zidells hired Fishman, an environmental consultant, to oversee a voluntary cleanup.
I said, guys, I will do this, but I'm only going to work half-time because I need the other half-time to see a therapist to figure out why I'm saying yes. This riverbank, before we started, was very, very steep, covered with all kinds of rubble, concrete, asphalt, metal, all kinds of industrial and urban debris that had been dumped here. It was truly a mess.
Cleaning it all up meant clearing debris and removing the most contaminated soil and river sediment. They covered the land and a portion of the riverbed with a thick layer of clean sand, dirt, and gravel.
This entire property now is capped. So there's a protective barrier of at least 2 feet of clean material between people, wildlife, fish, etc. So we've cut off the source of contamination.
Then they started planting.
It's really a whole ecosystem that I don't like to use the word restored because it's not the way it was 200 or 300 years ago and beyond, but it's really a simulation of a very native riparian riverbank, and we're very, very proud of it. It looks great.
By cleaning up an ecological mess, the Zidell family redeemed their own tainted land. It took 20 years and $20 million, but now they have a clean piece of riverfront property and a chance to be part of Portland's next chapter of reinvention and redevelopment.
Thanks, Cassandra Profita and public media partner EarthFix for that report. For more information about our program, just click on klcs.org and then click Contact Us to send us your questions and comments or story ideas so we can hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar.